Good evening and welcome to the City of Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for Wednesday, May 23rd, 2018. Karen, could we have the roll call?
Atkins?
Here.
Arnson?
Yep, here.
Here. Hartley? Holst?
Here.
Leeper?
Here.
Oberly? Saul?
Here.
Winger?
Here. We have approval of minutes of the previous meeting. Is there a move to approve?
I move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Motion carries. We'll have public comments. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to address an issue with the commission that's not an agenda item? Well, seeing none, we'll move on from public comments. We have no old business tonight. And under our new business, we have item A is a rezoning amendment to the zoning agreement, lots 7 and 8 of Midway Business Park. And David, you are introducing that item tonight?
Thank you, Mr. Holtz. Tonight is an introduction to this first request, which is a rezoning agreement amendment to a property in the Midway Business Park development off of Green Hill Road. It's identified there on the map. Just give a little background history on this property. Prior to 1995, this 9-acre parcel was zoned R1, which was part of the Midway addition there off of Cedar Heights, included in Lovejoy, Cardinal, and Valley High Drive. And at that time, the property owner requested a rezoning of that development to an R4 zoning district. And the idea was to create more of an office, kind of a professional office park there, as Green Hill Road was just constructed about that time. So we saw kind of an idea for that area. And during that process, it kind of brought out some concerns from nearby property owners. They looked at increased traffic. They may cut through that existing residential subdivision, residential parking, high density development, which is associated to that R4 zoning district. So with that, the developer, the property owner, agreed to do this zoning agreement to restrict the use of that R4 zone just for solely professional office use only. So that's kind of what has been acted since that rezoning since 1995. Again, that property is located along Green Hill Road. Moving along as the development continues, it started with the Midway second edition in 1999, and that created 4 residential lots, single-family lots, off of Lovejoy Drive. So that created a cul-de-sac in that area. So with that new cul-de-sac, it essentially takes away that movement or that traffic movement and isolates the rest of the development, which is about 7.5 acres, which is called the Midway Business Park, and that was created in 2003. 9 new lots for that commercial development. So since then, the property owner, which was First Security State Bank, purchased all those lots, and they decided to build their branch facility down at Green Hill Circle. And that was there since, I believe, 2003, and then more recently, the foundation, Community Foundation Northeast Iowa built their new building there at the end of Green Hill Circle. So development's kind of hasn't been taking place very much in that area. So the new proposal is just at the northeast corner of that for a senior housing facility, and this is just a site plan of what that layout's going to look like. The staff report reflected a 2-story building, but this is going to be a single-story building for 16 residents. And again, these are senior assisted facility. Each resident has their own bedroom and bathroom, but they all come to common areas. So it's not 16 individual dwelling units. It's just basically 1 unit for those tenants or residents. They will not drive to this facility. The parking is there just for the employees and visitors. So basically that site plan, as indicated on the slide, satisfies zoning requirements for the district, setbacks, and parking and landscaping. This is a permitted use in the R4 zoning district, so staff believes that this is kind of less intense use, and we would like to move forward with this approval based on comments from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and we'd like to schedule a public hearing next meeting. We're not going to rezone this property, but we have to change that zoning agreement to allow this type of facility. So that would include that revised zoning agreement and deed of dedication. Notice did go out to the property owners surrounding this area and had received one email from Community Foundation. They had a question about the parking, and that was taken care of.
And no other comments have been received at this time then?
No, no other comments. The developer here is present to answer any questions if there are any.
Would anybody like to address the commission on behalf of the, please come forward and state your name and address.
My name is Eric Blakesley. I'm actually on 4037 Scenic Drive. We're just wondering, are the trees going to be removed there along that area?
If,
You want to come up to the microphone? And give your name and address.
Luke Moore, Cedar Falls, address.
Yeah.
That's on the, we would like not to for the privacy factor, we understand that, but we don't know the exact, I haven't walked the lot or actually measured on the lot. With the drawings, I think, I don't know if it, can you pull that back up there?
the site plan is shown on the screen, if we can pull that up. You can kind of see the
So,
tree
from the
stand.
site plan, I don't think we'll have to. We might have to trim back a little bit, but we'd rather not get rid of that. We, you know, like everybody wants some privacy.
Yeah, we'd like to see it, I mean, if there was something we could do to keep that.
Yeah, and if,
that privacy.
if we had to do something, I'm sure we could make something back to create privacy again. But there won't be any outside noise or, you know, much going on there, so.
Okay.
No, I think that very well is
And there's no intention of taking Scenic Drive for that area, you know, around my house, Scenic Drive on into that field there ever?
Not on, no, none for
Not
me.
part of this plan
No,
or
no.
future plan?
You're referring to the field to the north of this development?
Well, yeah, it'd be the north.
That field is a detention basin. It serves as open space and detention. It's owned by the city, and that will remain that way in perpetuity.
Great.
Well, I do have one.
If you want to have a sir, if you want to have a question, you need to come to the microphone and give your name and address.
Property line,
Hold on.
easement.
Name and address. Name and address, please.
Oh, Terry Henniger, 4031 Scenic. I live right next door. I'm the one that's got all the trees there.
Okay, great.
That gives us our privacy that we want to keep.
And your question is?
The easement, I remember, we've been there 44 years now. I remember one of the city engineers was out there surveying, and he said there was a 10-foot easement, but I never knew if it was 5-foot Waterloo side, 5-foot Cedar Falls, or what. Just out of curiosity. I guess I'm concerned because will they go down through there and put things in, bury stuff? Any plans on any of that?
Good question.
The plat for that Midway Business Park development, there's a 35-foot rear yard setback along that property line along the east side. There's some easements identified along the street, but nothing along there. But if there's anything along that east property line, it's within that setback, so there's no development in that
I
area.
don't understand the 35-foot setback.
The building can't be any closer than 35 feet from that lot line.
Okay,
From that-
Waterloo Cedar Falls boundary?
From,
line?
yes, from your lot line. It's kind of a shared lot line on the corporate limits. But the building's going to be set closer to the street more than that 35-foot rear yard.
The only reason I ask is for 44 years, we've kind of taken care of that and maintained it. And I know there's a good 60 foot there that don't belong to us, and isn't that we want to keep the property. We really like the privacy. And that's the only reason I'm concerned. But thank you, appreciate it.
Thanks.
That's it.
Any other comments or questions for anybody from the commission?
Seems like it's a pretty consistent use.
So this is introduction tonight.
Yes,
and it'll
we
be
will
on.
send a notice to the courier for a public hearing on next meeting, June
June 13th.
13th.
Okay. Commissioners, any other discussion or questions at this time?
It looks like a good project.
Yeah.
All right, so this will move on till to next week or next meeting. Item B is floodplain ordinance amendments, and David, you're handling that also, right?
Thank you. This is kind of a follow-up as well. It's an introduction to some ordinance changes we like to take place in the zoning code, specifically our floodplain sections of the zoning code. Kind of a follow-up to our annual visit we have with the DNR back. It was last year, and the DNR really wants to get out and talk to the communities that have the floodplain ordinances and does the administration for that. And again, we had our community assistant visit, which is CAV visit in 2017, and basically the DNR made some recommendations, changes to our ordinance. Cedar Falls is determined to be in good standing with National Floodplain Insurance Program, and there's kind of criteria when we participate in that program. It's either we're in good standing, a community's on probation, or they're suspended from the program. And probation is they would get notice saying you're not administering, you're not enforcing your own floodplain ordinance, or we may need to make some changes. That probation period may be 6 months to a year. If changes aren't made, they'll be suspended. So when your community is on probation and suspension, that means that they cannot receive federal aid for any flood disaster relief, or all flood insurance policies in the city is removed. So a person cannot carry flood insurance. So to be in good standing with the NFIP is what we want, and that's where we're at. Staff maintains the ordinance and does a good job with that. So with that, and with those comments from the DNR in our visit, is there was some floodplain definitions we want to add. There's some changes to some definitions, some new definitions that were brought down from the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA, and we want to go over some of those definitions tonight in our zoning code. Also, there's some changes to our performance standards in section 156 of our floodplain district, and that pertains to detached structures. We want to make some changes to some elevation requirements. Right now, if you want to have a detached structure, you can have one at grade up to 576 square feet, which is a 24 by 24 garage. Anything over that has got to be elevated. So there's some exceptions added to that, saying if you're not elevated, there may be some increased insurance requirements for those contents in the garage and for that structure. Also, there's some changes to that, saying the structures must be firmly anchored to prevent collapse and lateral movement. We're just kind of wordsmithing that section in that code. And then finally, with our stormwater management program, that's listed outside of the zoning ordinance in chapter 27, which is our utility chapter. And again, there are some floodplain definitions in that. We just want to be consistent between that chapter and the zoning chapter and the floodplain. Finally, just want to touch base on our community rating systems program, which is a CRS. FEMA has adopted this program. It's a volunteer program for communities to participate, and that basically gives communities some information and some policies to enact in the floodplain that's over and above the minimum standards. So we're rated as a level 5 or class 5 community in the state of Iowa, and the ones being the best, it goes from 1 to 10. And the higher the class you go, it allows those insurance premiums to be reduced at a certain percentage. So it's good to be in that program. We go over and above the minimum standards for our policy, so that's why we're at a pretty good class of level 5. So with these definitions, these changes, that'll just maintain our status in the CRS program. So I just want to kind of go through some of these definitions real quick. The idea for that is we have a definition section in the zoning ordinance, and those are just general zoning terms. And within that list of definitions, we got floodplain terms. So what we want to do is create a new subsection. One subsection would be general zoning ordinance terms, and the other one would just be general floodplain terms, just so we can kind of tell the two list of definitions apart. Base flood elevation is the elevation of those flood waters during that occasion or that flood event, and that's referred to BFEs, and those BFEs are shown on the flood maps and on our flood profiles. And you might have heard of the 100-year flood or the 500-year flood. Those are the base flood elevations for that particular area. And again, elevating structures, this requirement is to serve as a guide for those elevation requirements for structures, and as a structure is elevated, that does determine those flood insurance premiums. New definitions include factory-built home park or subdivisions. FEMA calls those mobile home parks, so we're going to add those terms, and those are new terms. Highest adjacent grade is just the grade around the structure. What's the highest around the structure? And we use that highest adjacent grade and compare that grade to what the BFE is, and that will tell a property owner or contractor how high to elevate and protect that structure. Moving on to repetitive loss, this kind of associated to the type of loss property is received at any particular flood event. Right now we take a look at degree of loss or substantial loss, and that means anything that in the loss of property that exceeds 50% value of the market value of the house. So when that threshold is determined, that would require that property owner to upgrade or elevate their house. Well, with repetitive loss, we can combine multiple flood events in order to reach that 50% rule. So if the 2008 flood events, someone might have a 25% loss, but then they might have had a 30% loss in the 2016 flood events. So both those together exceed that 50% rule, so then that's when they have to improve their structure, make sure it meets the current standards as we have in the ordinance. And this does allow the property owner to look for flood insurance funds to elevate. There are some funds out there to assist those property owners to elevate the structure. And again, it also adds value to our CRS performance. Start of construction, this is kind of a confusing definition with staff, but hopefully I got this cleared away. But basically, start of construction really determines when those flood maps are renewed, changed, any base flood elevation is changed, any flood zone is changed. So basically, if a map is changed, then your property must comply to the current zoning ordinance. So we're not going to say that, well, the map's changed, now everybody has to comply. It basically complies when a permit is issued. So if a flood event occurs, you come and get a flood development permit, you have to meet the current standards. So the start of construction makes reference to that new construction. It also defines the duration and type of project. So the duration is you come and get a building permit, you have 180 days to finish that job. So that includes any type of improvement. It does have exceptions that does not kick in that 180-day time frame, which is like site preparation or grading around the property. So that's just another change to that. So again, we want to recommend approval of those amendments. It does reinforce our flood insurance program and regulations. We'll meet those standards for FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Policy Program. So we'd like to hear any comments that you have and set a date for public hearing at the next meeting.
Commissioners, any questions or comments?
Yeah, David, I think back when we redid the ordinances, after the 2008 event, we spent a lot of time on fill and, those kind of topics. Mm-hmm. When we look at what you just had here, do you see any conflict with what we rewrote as far as how much fill we could bring in certain areas?
No, it doesn't impact the fill criteria for a property. It doesn't impact, we changed that elevation standard from 100 to 500 year plus 1 foot.
Right,
It doesn't change that. So really, it's more new definitions and some minor changes in the performance standards
Okay.
for garages. So
I'm just looking for conflict if one rule to another. Yeah.
I should have mentioned this earlier. Again, these were comments from DNR, so
Okay.
we developed a staff report and we sent this back down to them for final review, so they're kind of doing
okay.
that in the process.
All right.
So they're in the process of reviewing this, or they have reviewed it?
They sent us the comments, and then I kind of put this in the staff report, so I just gave them the opportunity for one more review.
Yeah.
And then when we put this in ordinance form, they'll take a look at it again.
And make any comments they have before we do a final approval on that?
And that's when we get to council.
Okay,
Yep.
Okay.
very good. Any other questions, thoughts? Well, it sounds like it's a fairly procedural operation. So this will be then again on the June 13th agenda for official approval or voting.
Yep.
Final item of new business, C, is a presentation, zoning codes, overview of various types of zoning. And Karen, you're going to be giving us a little update on that then, right?
Yes, I knew on such a nice day that everybody would want to stay and talk about zoning. And I put this together just because I knew that there was some anticipation that there would be some changes and updates to the city's zoning ordinance in the future, and just to give a broad overview of the different types of zoning. And I don't know, you may be familiar with some of these and less familiar with others, but I just thought I'd run through this and focus in on form-based zoning, because I've heard from a lot of people in the community some discussion about form-based zoning. It's something fairly new that's being tried in different parts of the across the nation, and with some pretty good success. And so just wanted to give some focus to that type of zoning, because you may not be familiar with what that is. So just in general, what are the benefits of zoning? I'm sure that you're familiar with this, but a good zoning code provides clear and objective standards that it makes development more predictable for the community in general. It stabilizes the market for land. If everybody knows what can be developed in your zoning code, from the developer to the community, it helps set that price of land so that people know how much to pay for a piece of land, because they know what they can use the land for. So there's a clear path for development review and approval, and it provides clear direction for developers, architects, property owners, realtors, the residents in the community, and the policymakers that are trying to make decisions based on applications that you receive. And also, a big part of that is it's intended to implement, it's intended to be a tool to implement the city's comprehensive plan. There's various types of zoning. Probably the most prevalent one across the country is the use-based zoning, sometimes referred to as Euclidean zoning. Most of the communities across the country have some sort of use-based zoning code. Vast majority of them. Some of those use-based codes have been adjusted over time to include some performance-based zoning and incentive-based zoning, and creating some sort of hybrid zoning code. And some communities have gone to a form-based zoning in some parts of their community. So some communities have all four of these types of zoning ordinances. So the premise behind and the organizing principle behind use-based zoning is basically separation of uses, separation into residential, commercial zones, industrial zones. And that was started back in 1926 when you had kind of dirty industrial uses and you're trying to separate residential areas from those dirtier uses in the community. That's the premise. So we still live with that sort of legacy from the 20s. It's been carried through till today. Each zone then has a basic set of dimensional standards: building setbacks, height, lot coverage, various site development standards. So the use-based zoning is intended to prevent, of course, nuisances, incompatibilities between different land uses, noise, glare, pollution. However, there has been a tendency to produce development where most of the trips in a community are made in a private vehicle. In other words, you're separating things, so you have to get in your car, to go to the shopping center. You have to get in your car to go to the school. You're not mixing the uses together all within one neighborhood, which was the pattern prior to World War II in a lot of our communities. And you can see some of that in Cedar Falls here in the older parts of town. So performance or impact-based zoning is basically adding in performance standards to a use-based zoning ordinance. For example, things to make uses more compatible. So you might allow a greater mix of land uses in one zone, but then you have standards there to make sure that they're more compatible. Hours of operation, talking about the scale of buildings, height of buildings, screening and buffering standards, landscaping standards to make things more private, and things like the concept of floor area ratio, meaning, building the amount of space you're filling the lot with a building. But some of those kinds of standards have little direct relationship to the look and feel of the resulting development, so they're difficult for a lot of people to understand how they're actually achieving the vision that the community has said that they want. So moving on to incentive-based zoning is also a use-based principle, organizing principle, but incentive-based zoning enables projects to exceed the base standard. So you say maybe the building can be 3 stories tall if they provide some additional benefit to the local community. For example, in exchange for providing parks, public art, affordable housing, you can give them a bonus. And maybe you get a taller building or a more dense development, or are allowed to cover more of the lot if you're doing things of public benefit that are above and beyond what the requirements in the code are. The issue with that type of zoning, it can achieve a lot of really great public benefits for the community, but it's usually a negotiated process. It's a little bit messier, can be time consuming and a little unpredictable. But like I said, it can result in some pretty good development for the community. So moving on to the final type of zoning. So we have all these traditional types of zoning that are really use-based zoning as opposed to form-based zoning. So traditional zoning techniques are all organized on that principle of separation of uses. Form-based zoning has a fundamentally different organizing principle. It's based on the form of the buildings, the placement of the buildings on the lot, placement of the parking on a lot, and how the private space of the building meets the public space at the street. So while land uses are a part of a form-based zoning ordinance, they do have a list of uses typically, but they're not the primary focus. So you can have a mixing of uses, you can have a building that has a certain use in it and they move out and another type of use moves in. So there's less of a focus on the land uses. And then finally, as I said, there's a lot of communities that have hybrid zoning codes that incorporate all these different types of zoning. Sometimes you have parts of your community that lend themselves more to our form-based code. Usually your more walkable, urban core type neighborhoods lend themselves well to form-based zoning, but it can be used all throughout the community as well. So just a little bit about a form-based code. So the beauty of a form-based code is that it can be customized to address the local character of an area. So you can get as fine-grained as looking at, say, a downtown or a core neighborhood and looking street by street, and you can code those streets to get exactly the type of character that you desire in the future. So you set it up so that you're trying to achieve a certain desired community character that's identified through a planning effort, and you're allowed to mix the uses over time And the development standards are fairly prescriptive. And the standards in the code are usually illustrated rather than described in narrative form. Now, a form-based code always has what they call a regulating plan. So that's where I was talking about you can dive right down into the details of your community. And this is a map of the regulating plan for a form-based zoning district in Iowa City, where it was based on primary streets and secondary streets. So the primary streets are the streets where we were focusing, the buildings face those streets, the side streets have less of a focus. So there's different standards on different streets. The regulating plan also can specify building heights. So you can fine tune it to say this street, the building heights are this. Maybe you have a street that has historic properties along it. You want to preserve those. So you can use this regulating plan to do just about anything that meets your vision. You can set that up to be very specific, or it can be fairly general, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So again, the standards a lot of times are illustrated. So here's some illustrations of parking and building placement. Here's the building placement. Here the buildings are placed toward the front of the lot. Here's the primary street. The focus is the entrances face that primary street. Here's the secondary street to the side. And then here's, in this particular location, this is the location where parking can be located. And then there's also usually some sort of height standards, but the residential or commercial intensity or density is really controlled by height and parking requirements, and sometimes those are also illustrated on the regulating plan. So usually there's a broad range of commercial or residential uses allowed. And those are allowed to transition over time. For example, maybe you have a street where you have older single-family homes, but it's right near a commercial area, and there's some desire to transform those into offices, private offices, but people don't want to lose the character of those homes. So it's coded so that those are preserved, but you're allowed to have commercial uses moving in, or you can maintain the residential use. So the idea is that uses can move in and out. Also can be used, for example, for an area, if it's a brand new area and you're trying to encourage some storefront commercial, but maybe the market's not quite there yet for it. But you want to build the building ahead of time before that market's quite ready for it. You want to invest that money to build the storefront space because you are anticipating that kind of demand for commercial. You could use that commercial, you could build it to a storefront standard, but then you could allow it to be used as sort of a live-work type unit where somebody could live there, maybe have a little home office or something. And then as the market reaches the point where you have that demand for, a coffee shop or retail or that sort of thing, that's when it can transition to other more intensive, retail uses. So once again, so less of a focus on the uses. So probably one of the most interesting things about a form-based code, and I think one of the most important things to think about is what we call a frontage condition. And that's the transition from the public space along the street to the private space, the transition from indoor to outdoor at the main entrance of a building, and that design treatment of the first story of the building, the configuration of the facade, projections, and the improvements within those required setbacks. So really how the building meets the street is really important, and really if you think about it, that's how people experience a city. Most of the time you're not wandering around looking up at the top of a building, you're walking down the street, and what you're experiencing is that first level floor and how those spaces meet the public sidewalk, basically. Or you're walking down a nice residential street and people have, their front porches and their front yards, and that's the experience that you have in that character of the neighborhood. So form-based code really focuses in on specifying appropriate types of frontage conditions with the appropriate type of building. So here's a storefront frontage. You know, we're all familiar with that. Have it downtown in all of our Main Street buildings. You know, it encourages shopping and window, you know, restaurants and activity at the street level. A forecourt is basically a frontage where a portion of the block is set back from the street. Here's some examples here. A commercial example where they set this back and created an amenity for the neighborhood, an urban neighborhood. It's a little bit of green space in the middle of a dense urban environment. And this is your typical old U-shaped apartment building. You've probably all seen those where you have the middle portion, the entranceway set back from the street to create a little courtyard in the front. You know, stoops. We have those, you know, most buildings, a lot of buildings have stoops where the first level of the floor is raised up. And mostly this is used for residential development. The idea here is particularly if the building is fairly close to the street, it's a residential building, people are walking along the sidewalk. If you raise that first floor up a little bit, it provides some privacy for people aren't looking right into your window as they're walking by. So that's the idea of having the front stoop. And you know, that's a typical thing that's been happening for, you know, hundreds of years, that principle of creating that privacy. So, you know, you've seen those kind of buildings all over the place, from modern to more traditional type brownstone buildings. And then the idea of a terrace or a dooryard, it's the same idea. You raised up a residential use above the sidewalk. Usually the buildings are pretty close to the street, but then it provides a little bit of open space, a little bit of space between the public sidewalk and the private space, creates a little semi-private space for use of the residents of the building. Now this can be raised up, it can be behind a fence, so it creates a little dooryard or a raised terrace. And here's some examples from some buildings and how that, you know, creates a little bit of privacy, a little bit of open space, but and then the public sidewalk is right, you know, nearby. And then, you know, the porch frontage. Everybody's familiar with that. And here's some nice examples. So the idea is to pair those appropriate frontage standards with the appropriate type of building. So form-based codes will often have building types depending on the area of the city you're in. You know, a typical residential neighborhood. This is the concept of, I don't know if you've heard the term missing middle housing. Have you heard that? It's kind of a new buzz term that's out there. Coined by Dan Perolik from Opticos Design, a firm out of California. But basically the idea is that we used to build neighborhoods like this. We used to build neighborhoods that had a mix of housing types, from single-family homes, duplexes, triplexes, you know, little bungalow courts, and townhomes, and they used to all be mixed into the same neighborhood. But the idea is that they were all the same scale, so they all seem to really go together. And I think if you walk around in the central part of Cedar Falls, you see some of those little courtyard buildings, some of the little duplexes, and when you're walking by, they're really the scale of a single-family home, so they just all really blend well together. Even those are a little bit more dense, they have more people living there, they really feel like they fit in with the character of the neighborhood. Well, we stopped building these, you know, after World War II, and a lot of zoning codes basically disallowed that because we separated the uses and said you can only build single-family homes here. Over here you can build, you know, townhomes, and over here you can build, you know, multifamily buildings. And so that's why he coined the phrase missing middle, because we missed a lot of these types of housing, but there's a real demand for that sort of walkable urban neighborhood, and a desire for, you know, empty nesters, people that are trying to downsize, also young people that are trying to start out this little more affordable type units. So here's just, you know, some illustrations of the various types of buildings. This is an interesting one that's kind of interesting. It's the idea of you take several lots in a neighborhood and you create small little cottages that surround a green courtyard, and it creates a little sort of community. So that's called a cottage court, and I think some communities have adopted cottage cluster ordinances to allow this sort of thing. It's very popular in cities that have an affordable housing problem, and also very popular amongst people that are retirees and empty nesters that are trying to downsize but still want that sense of community, that sense of single-family character. Of course, the typical row houses with the alley-loaded garages, and of course the townhomes. The idea here is that all the entrances have to face the street, and you tuck your garages behind the units, so they still have that residential character along the street. Here's townhouses, a little more dense. You don't have the rear yards, and so you have what you call a parking mews between the residential units. These units face this street, and then these units face the opposing street. So here is an example from Iowa City of townhomes that were built in the central part of the city. These are the units as they face one of the streets, and then this is the parking mews behind. So there's 2 rows of these, and then everybody parks in a central courtyard behind the units. The idea I mentioned of live-work townhomes, the idea that you could live and work in the same space. It's kind of an urban type of living. I think you also see them sometimes in mixed-use buildings where the first level, I think Des Moines has some live-work units in the East Village where people have professional offices, but they're also where they're living. Small apartment buildings that are of a scale of a large house that fits into a neighborhood. I think this is a 6-plex. And then the larger, of course, moving up in density to the larger multi-family buildings, and they could be any configuration. And then up again to the idea of a mixed-use building. Now, just I want to point out that form-based code isn't necessarily about architecture or style. You can make it that way. You could adopt standards that talk about a certain style of architecture, but that's not the basis of a code. Form-based code can allow everything from modern architecture to more traditional forms of the building. And then just your basic commercial buildings. This is an interesting building type. It's called a liner building. So, we do need parking. A lot of times there's parking structures in denser parts of the city. And this is the idea that you want to kind of shield the view of a parking garage from the street. So you build a shallow building that hides the parking from view. And that can be everything from a mixed-use building. Here's one that's in front of a parking garage. Here is a drawing of a liner building that's been built in Iowa City. There's a municipal parking garage. It doesn't quite look like this. This was the original design, but there is a parking structure behind it, and then there's all these townhome units that face the street. And I think there's like 600 parking spaces behind the townhomes. And then the codes usually have some allowance, of course, for the buildings, institutional buildings in the community. So once again, the code not only, usually zoning codes just regulate private space and the public spaces, public right-of-way, the sidewalks in the street. A form-based zoning ordinance often will regulate both. So there's a lot of times street standards in a form-based code, and it also speaks to how that private space meets the public space. Here's this drawing here. This line represents the public right-of-way space, so this is public space here, excuse me, and this is the private frontage area. So the code will have standards for street trees, public sidewalks, what can happen in this, what they call the public realm, and then how that frontage type meets that public space. So the setback, there'll be setback standards that say, in this particular area, you have to set your building back here, but your stoop and your porch can extend into that area. And then usually there's some sort of building design standards in a form-based code that really speak to things like bulk of the building, so kind of breaking up the facade to create that rhythm along the street. So sometimes building articulation standards, building entranceway standards, window coverage, building materials, design of the roof, signage standards that are appropriate to the frontage type. So everything is designed in context with what you have on your regulating plan, basically. So different parts of the community would have different building design standards potentially. This is an illustration of a pedestrian street. In some areas you might have a block where you don't have a street, but you want to create some opportunities for building frontages, because in a form-based code, every building has to meet the street. And so if you don't have a street, you need to create a street. And so this is the idea that creates that walkable environment. And so in this particular case, this was like a large block, and so they punched through a pedestrian street, and so that these units could face that street, and you created this nice walkable space in the middle of that block. Here's another smaller example of some townhomes that face a little pedestrian courtyard. In Iowa City, we use that idea in the Riverfront Crossings District. This is a major arterial street, and this is a new floodplain park over here. So there wasn't really a need to continue the street grid, but we wanted to create a street grid. But we didn't need to allow the vehicles to go there because the park was in the way. And so the idea was to create these green streets, these pedestrian streets that would lead over to the park. And then sometimes you have special provisions that you desire in the community, like open space requirements for denser housing types. And then, of course, there's flexibility usually built into the code because they have fairly prescriptive standards. You know, you're going to have situations where you have steep slopes or irregular shaped lots. Maybe you have buildings that front on a creek or some sort of environmental feature. So there's usually some flexibility built right into the standards that say in these situations, things can be adjusted fairly easily through an administrative process or through fairly easy review by a committee or a design review committee, something like that. So it keeps things moving, and there's specific standards in the code that are set up to address those types of situations. So just in summary, you know, there's many different options for zoning, and you know, some based on the context and goals that we're trying to achieve in the community. And the basics of good zoning apply regardless of the type of zoning that we're using. So the idea is to continue to try to improve the zoning code and establish clear and objective standards and eliminate the kind of ambiguity that creates a lot of problems with the process. That will provide more certainty in the market and less risk and cost for developers and less risk for the neighborhood residents as well, and for the policymakers because there's more certainty. So it encourages investment and reinvestment in the community, and development is more aligned with the vision that the community's established. So that's all I have today. You have any questions?
So was the form-based one that's being kind of looked at a little more towards redoing our code?
Well, I know it's been discussed. I've heard different people talk about it. I don't know if anything's really been decided, and it could be that maybe we try it in a certain area of town and see how it goes. A lot of communities will start out by trying it in one section and see you know, how it operates, and
Kind of a pilot.
pilot program, yeah. And Iowa City did that. They have a couple different areas where they've adopted form-based zoning, and because they've been fairly successful, now everybody's a little bit comfortable with it. The developers are kind of used to how it works. The community has sort of accepted it, and so now Iowa City is moving to doing more form-based zoning. Now, there's some cities that just go whole, you know, the city of Miami has adopted it, the entire city has adopted the form-based code. It's a huge undertaking because you do have to do that fine-grained visioning of your community, so. And then sometimes you have areas of your city that just don't lend themselves that well to a form-based zoning code, and so other approaches may be a better option.
What does it look like? I mean, to me, maybe like your basic single-family, large tract of residential homes is maybe not it's not maybe particularly useful for that, but anytime as you get more and more dense, it seems like there's more value to that.
Right, yeah.
In terms of creating flexibility and that type of thing.
Right, right.
And creating flexibility, but still have a good standard of,
Right.
Yeah,
Seems like a much more kind of intentional form of development.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that people have found that you kind of get more what you think you're going to get with the form-based code. At least that's been my experience. But, you know, the City of Cedar Falls has some form-based standards in the ordinance. So a lot of communities don't realize they have form-based standards in their ordinance. It's just kind of mixed in with other things. And I think Iris, I believe, was here talking about establishing new storefront standards downtown. Those are all
That's form-based.
form-based standards.
Yeah.
And so it would be sort of that hybrid approach until you had a full-blown form-based code.
Well, it seems like, especially if Main Street, as those older homes on Main Street going further south transition out, you know, it just makes sense to do some of that, especially in that area, you know.
Right, and it can be set up to preserve things as well. You know, you can have a form-based code in a historic area. And, you know, everything doesn't have to look like downtown. You know, you set up your code. So if the character you desire is to have the building set back 20 feet from the street with a nice front yard and front porches and a lower scale development, maybe you can still mix the uses. You can have some of those cottage courts and some single-family homes, some duplexes mixed in, but then they'd all have that same way, you know, character along the street as you're walking in that neighborhood. So.
Thank you for bringing it to us.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
So what's the next steps in our review of the zoning?
Well, I think we have to decide kind of what we want to do, because it is a big undertaking to, you know, update the entire zoning ordinance. So it could be that we bite off in little chunks, but staff is still discussing and
coming up with a plan to attack it?
yes.
Okay.
So we'll let you know. Stay tuned.
Okay.
I would encourage us to move forward.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from the commission?
I'll make one more comment. It seems like College Hill would be a great place to start.
Yeah, that would be a good
know.
opportunity as well.
And or Main Street.
Yeah, Main Street too.
All right, thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
I think that ends our business for the evening. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor signify by aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.